The Veth had never lost a ground commander in single combat. Sergeant Miracalis was about to change that, and she was doing it for a dead man she had never stopped arguing with. The fortress hung above the gas giant like a blister of light against the dark 30 kilometers of layered armor and kill corridors, and the kind of silence that only exists where no air can carry sound. They called it the Spine. The Veth had held it for 11 years. Every human attempt to take it had ended the same way. Bodies floating in expansion clouds, wreckage spiraling down into the planet's ammonia atmosphere, and the Veth transmitting their standard post-battle communique, a single sustained tone, which human xenolinguists had eventually decoded as the Veth equivalent of a shrug. That tone had played after the Battle of Halcyon Station. It had played after the Karanov assault. It had played 16 times in 11 years, and each time it played, the expeditionary fleet received new orders from Orbital Command. On Earth, and new commanders arrived on fresh ships, and the same argument happened in every briefing room across every vessel in the human fleet. We need to take the Spine, and we cannot take the Spine, and therefore someone else must be made responsible for what happens next. Callis had sat through 11 versions of that argument. She had watched 11 commanders nod gravely at casualty projections and then order advances anyway. She had carried 9 of those commanders out of the field on stretchers, and 1 she had carried in pieces, and 1, Colonel Haversham Brennan, she had carried out of the field alive, which had only made it worse, because he had 4 months in a recovery ward, dictating his memoirs into a recorder, and the memoirs contained extensive passages about Callis's insubordination. She had been insubordinate. She did not dispute that. What she disputed, with a precision that Brennan had apparently found exhausting, was whether insubordination was the correct word. For refusing to send 40 soldiers into a corridor that thermal imaging had confirmed was full of Veth shock infantry. The word she preferred was survival. Brennan had survived. The 40 soldiers had survived. 3 of Brennan's hand-picked officers, who had taken the corridor anyway with a different squad, had not survived. Callis did not mention this in her own report. She simply noted the outcome. She mentioned it now, to nobody, because she was alone in the pre-entry staging bay of Droopship 7. Doing the thing she always did before a deployment. Checking her equipment in the wrong order, starting with the item she least expected to need, and ending with the one that mattered most. It was a ritual that had no tactical logic, and that she had developed in the 4th year of the war. After Corporal Damjon Rees had died because he had checked his oxygen seal last, and discovered the fault when it was too late to do anything about it. She checked hers first. She moved to the combat restraint second. She left the pulse rifle for last, even though it was the obvious starting point, because Rees had been obvious, and obvious was how you died. The rest of the squad filtered in at T-20, 8 of them. 4 she had worked with long enough to know their habits. Voss, who hummed folk songs when nervous and claimed she wasn't nervous. Cherenko, who ate half a ration bar before every insertion and saved the other half for after, and had been saving the second half of the same bar for 3 weeks and refused to acknowledge this. Mello, who was the best close-quarters fighter Callis had ever seen and who had a laugh like a mechanical failure in a recycling unit. And Obina, who was quiet in the way that meant something, not in the way that meant nothing. The other 4 were transfers from the 6th Expeditionary, reassigned after the 6th's commander had been posted to Orbital Command, following what Callis privately called the mess at Whitmore Gate, and what official records called a tactical engagement, resulting in acceptable unit losses. 42% casualties was apparently acceptable. She did not say this to the 4 new soldiers. She looked at them long enough to read something true in each face, then looked away. She had learned not to look too long. It made things harder after. 12 minutes, she said. Check your seals. Check your restraints. If you're using the secondary oxygen coupling because your primary is showing amber, tell me now. I will not be angry. I will be angry if you don't tell me. Silence. Then a hand from one of the 6th soldiers. A young man with a pale scar running from his left ear to his jaw. Sergeant. My primary's showing amber. What's your name? Decker. Private First Class Decker. Swap with Voss. Voss has a backup unit. Voss? Voss, who had been humming something under her breath, reached into her kit without complaint and handed over the backup coupling. Decker began switching out the fittings. His hands were steady. Callis noted this the same way she noted everything. Not warmly, not coldly, just accurately. The Veth on that station don't expect us, she said to all of them. Command has been feeding them false traffic for 6 days. They think the assault is coming from the daylight face. We're coming from the shadow quadrant. This is not a secret advantage. It's about 40 seconds. After 40 seconds, they will know where we are, and they will respond accordingly, and then it becomes the kind of fight they expect to have, and we are very bad at those. She paused. Cherenko had taken out the half-ration bar. He peeled back the wrapper with the care of someone handling evidence. So we need to do our work in 40 seconds, and then find somewhere defensible, and make them come to us. We are very good at the fights they don't expect to have. Questions? No questions. Voss had stopped humming. Good, Callus said. Because I lied. We have 11 seconds, not 40. What I told you was 40. The actual number is 11. I am telling you now so you aren't surprised. I am not telling you what I told Command, because Command, if they knew the real number, would cancel the operation, and this operation needs to happen. She watched their faces absorb this information. Obina's expression didn't change at all. Mellows did something complicated that ended in the mechanical failure laugh, cut short. Decker looked at the man beside him, Kowalczyk, and Kowalczyk looked back at him, and something passed between them that Callus chose not to read. 11 seconds, Decker said. To do what exactly? To cut the relay node in Corridor 7 Alpha. After that, the spine's internal communications grid runs on backup sequencing, and backup sequencing has a delay. That delay is long enough for us to move through the station without the next section knowing the previous section has already been cleared. You memorize the station's internal communications architecture. I memorized the station's internal communications architecture. He stared at her. How? I asked very specific questions of the Veth prisoner we held at Karanov for 8 months and paid close attention to the answers. She checked the pulse rifle. It was exactly as she'd left it. He didn't know he was answering questions about the spine specifically. He thought we were asking about Veth military construction philosophy. In general, we were. The spine follows the philosophy. Most things do if you pay attention. The docking clamps released. The dropship shuddered. 11 seconds, she said again. Starting from when the airlock cycles, move fast. Don't shoot unless you have to. We can't afford the sound. They went in fast and quiet through the shadow quadrant, through a maintenance access port that the Veth used for automated resupply drones and had not armored, because why would you armor a hole barely large enough for a supply drone? And by the time Callus reached Corridor 7 Alpha, she had been moving for exactly 9 seconds. And the relay node was exactly where she had expected it to be, and she had it cut in 2 seconds flat, and then they were in the blind space between the spine's knowledge of itself and the truth of what was happening inside it. And Callus said, very quietly, now we work. The spine had 140 Veth on it, give or take. Callus knew this, because she had spent 3 years building a picture of Veth garrison doctrine from prisoner accounts, intercepted transmissions, and the careful study of every human survivor who had been inside a Veth military installation and come back. Most hadn't come back. The ones who had were often not in a state to be interviewed, but Callus had sat with them anyway, in medical wards and recovery facilities, and once in a rehabilitation center on the coast of what used to be Portugal, and she had asked the same questions with the same patience she had used on the Karanov prisoner. And she had built the picture piece by piece, and the picture told her things that the official briefings didn't, because the official briefings were built on tactical data, and Callus's picture was built on something else. It was built on the small things, the way Veth garrison troops positioned themselves relative to exits, the frequency of their patrols in the gap. There was always a gap between the end of one patrol rotation and the beginning of the next. The way they used sound. The Veth had better hearing than humans in the mid-range frequencies, which was why all the official doctrine said to maintain strict silence during infiltration operations. But they had worse hearing in the high frequencies, which nobody had written down anywhere because it hadn't seemed relevant. But Callus had asked a survivor who had been a xenobiologist before the war, and the xenobiologist had said, yes, their auditory range cuts off around 14 kilohertz. And Callus had filed this away for 3 years, and had only now found the exact situation in which it mattered. She signaled to Voss. Voss produced a small device that looked like a damaged signal repeater and was not. It emitted a tone at 16 kilohertz, which the Veth could not hear, and which bounced off the surfaces of the corridor and came back in a pattern that Voss read on a small display. It told them where the heat signatures were on the other side of each wall. 3, Voss said very quietly. The patrol, there, she tilted the display, calculating. They're going the wrong direction. away from us. For about 40 seconds, Callus said. Then they looped back, 40 seconds. The number that should have been her buffer from the beginning. She took it now, in the interior of the station, as a small gift from a universe that owed her many larger ones and had been slow to pay. They cleared the first section in 38 seconds. Nobody shot anything. Malo used her hands once, efficiently, on a Veth sentry, who came around a corner 12 seconds early, which meant the patrol pattern had shifted, which meant someone in the station's command structure had done something unexpected, which was the thing Callus feared most and had planned for anyway. Pattern shift, she told Obina. Tell me why. Obina had been monitoring the station's backup communications on a frequency Callus had given him, listening to the delay pattern of signals rather than their content, because the content was encrypted and the delay patterns were not. Something came in from outside, he said, 90 seconds ago. External transmission. I don't know what it said. It said something changed, she thought for a moment. The main fleet. They're early. Admiral Carver's fleet was supposed to make its feint at the daylight face in 30 minutes. If the fleet was early, if something in Carver's own timeline had shifted, then the Veth on the spine had received warning that the human fleet was approaching ahead of schedule, and they had tightened their patrols in response, and the careful 11-second gap that Kella spent 3 years calculating was now 8 seconds, maybe less. She did not tell the squad any of this. There was no value in it. Instead, she said, new pace. We skip Section 3, take Section 4 from the service access above it. Come down through the ceiling. She paused. Decker, Servergent. The ceiling panels in Veth military installations are not load-bearing. They are cosmetic. The actual structural ceiling is 40 centimeters above them. Do not put your weight on the panels. A pause. How do you know that? The xenobiologist, she said, and left it there. The move through the ceiling space above Section 4 was the worst part. Not because of the danger, but because of the smell. Veth installations ran warm, and in the enclosed space, the heat and the particular organic scent of Veth occupancy was thick enough to taste. And Callus, 2 of the 6th soldiers suppressed sounds of distaste, and she did not blame them, and she said nothing. You could not train people out of involuntary physical responses. You could only train them not to let those responses make noise. They came down through a service access in the far wall of Section 4, bypassing it entirely, and entered Section 5, which was the station's communications hub, which was what they had come for. Veth communications infrastructure looked nothing like human communications infrastructure. This was not a metaphor. It was not even a generalization. It was a specific practical problem that had defeated 2 previous teams who had reached the spine's communications hub and found a room full of biological electrochemical relays that bore no functional resemblance to anything in their training. The first team had done nothing and retreated. The second team had cut everything they could reach, which had the effect of alerting every Veth on the station that something had happened and triggering a lockdown. Callus had the Karanov prisoners' responses, filtered through 3 years of cross-referencing with xenobiological literature, and the testimony of the xenobiologist on the coast of Portugal, who had once been imprisoned in a Veth facility for 4 months, and had spent that time, in her words, observing everything carefully because there was nothing else to do. The xenobiologist had drawn diagrams from memory. Callus had those diagrams memorized. What she was looking at when she entered the communications hub, and she knew which of the pulsing biological nodes in the center of the room was the primary command relay. And she knew how to interrupt it without triggering an alarm. And she did it in 45 seconds, while the rest of the squad held the corridor outside. The spine went quiet, not silent. There was still the distant vibration of the station's mechanical systems, the low-frequency hum that Callus felt in her back teeth rather than heard. But the communications pattern that Obina had been monitoring dropped to 0, and in the gap she heard Obina exhale through his nose, very slowly, the way people exhale when they have been holding something they didn't know they were holding. How long, Cherenko asked from the corridor, until they noticed the silence and switched to manual protocols. Callus was already moving. 11 minutes, maybe 12. The real number or the number you tell command? The real number. She looked at him. I only lie to command when they're in a position to stop me. You're not. He finished the first half of the ration bar. Fair, he said. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not a battle in any sense that the official record would have recognized. There were no fleet movements, no orbital bombardments, no decisive tactical exchanges. There were 8 humans moving through a Veth space station corridor by corridor, using information that had been gathered across 3 years from sources that no briefing document had ever cited, taking a fortified installation, not through force but through something that had no good military term for it. Through the accumulated specific knowledge of a single person who had paid attention when nobody else thought paying attention was worth the time. They reached the command node, the spine's primary command structure, a chamber at the station's geometric center, where the senior Veth officer coordinated garrison operations. At the 8-minute mark, outside the chamber's entrance, Callus stopped the squad. "The commander in there," she said. "His name is..." She used the human rendering of the Veth designation, a sequence of clicks and tonal shifts that human language couldn't approximate, so the translation units called him Grace. Grace has been commanding this installation for 9 years. He is the reason the spine hasn't been taken. Every previous team that reached this station found the internal layout different from what intelligence predicted. Because Grace rearranges it. He moves the patrol nodes. He changes the relay frequencies. He adapts. "So how are we here?" Decker said. "If he adapts, because he adapts to tactical responses," Callus said. "He changes where the patrols are. He changes how the communications work. He does not change the biology of his soldiers, or the physics of his station, or the fact that 16 kilohertz bounces off a Veth wall surface at a predictable angle." She looked at the door. "What he has not adapted to is the possibility that someone knows all of this, because the information that built this operation doesn't exist in any database he's ever had access to. It's in my head." She had thought about what to say at this moment, not for effect, but because she had learned that soldiers performed better when they understood the shape of what they were doing. She had thought about Brennan, who had liked to make speeches, and about the 16 post-battle tones, and about Rees, who had died because he'd checked the obvious things first, and about the xenobiologist on the Portuguese coast who had drawn diagrams for months and never expected them to be useful to anyone. She decided on, "Stay behind me." The chamber door was not locked because Grice had 30 armed soldiers between him and any possible intruder, and all 30 of those soldiers were now sitting very still in areas that Callus's team had sealed or bypassed or simply walked around. And the chamber door opened at a contact signal from the Veth access panel, which Callus applied using a technique the Karanov prisoner had demonstrated repeatedly, while apparently believing they were having an abstract conversation about Veth architecture. The chamber was smaller than expected. This was the thing about command structures, human and Veth alike apparently, that nobody ever represented accurately in briefings. They were always smaller than the briefings suggested. There was one senior Veth present, attended by 3 others who were clearly not combatants. Grace himself was recognizable from the intelligence photographs. Tall even by Veth standards, with the coloration pattern around his thoracic plates that indicated either senior rank or significant age, or both, and an arrangement of sensory organs that a human face reader would have described as alert. He was alert. He had heard them coming, not through the communication system, which was down, but through some other combination of his senses that Callus had not accounted for. He was already oriented toward the door when they came through it. He had something in his upper appendages that was not quite a weapon, but was clearly not a communications device. Callus entered first. She held her pulse rifle in a way that she hoped communicated, "I have it, but I'm not pointing it at you, and this is intentional." What followed was not a conversation in any meaningful sense. The Veth did not have translation units, and Callus's unit was calibrated for the Karanov dialect, which was close but not identical to whatever Grice spoke. What happened instead was something more like 2 people at a table who both understand the game, but neither speaks the other's language, reading each other through posture and gesture and the specific quality of silence. Grace put the not-quite weapon down. He did it with a deliberateness that suggests the decision cost him something, and that he had made it quickly, because the alternative cost more. Callus said, in the Karanov dialect that her unit translated imperfectly, "Surrender. No harm." The translation unit said something back, and then Grace made a gesture with his upper appendages that her unit flagged as ambiguous. It could mean acceptance, or it could mean "I am noting your request for future reference," which was not the same thing. Then Mello did something Callus had not anticipated and would not have authorized. She laughed. The mechanical failure sound, unmistakable, bouncing off the chamber walls, and Grice's sensory organs tracked toward it with an expression that Callus could only describe as surprised, because the laugh was so specifically, categorically human in its texture, so involuntary, so unstrategic, so alien to the cold geometry of the situation, that it seemed to communicate something that neither translation unit could have carried. Grace made another gesture. Her unit flagged it as acknowledged. It was close enough. They held the command node for 19 minutes before the first Veth attempt to retake it, which was professional and forceful, and came from a direction that Callus had predicted and prepared for, and they held through that attempt and 2 more after it. And when Admiral Carver's fleet, running 40 minutes early for reasons that Callus would later learn, had to do with a navigational miscalculation that Command would describe in official documents as a deliberate advance timing, completed its feat at the daylight face, and the Veth responded by pulling garrison forces to counter it. The Thoth squad found themselves holding a quiet command chamber with 6 Veth prisoners, including a senior commander, and the corridor outside empty, and the station's communications, still cycling through a backup protocol that couldn't carry orders fast enough to coordinate a counter-assault. Callus sat down on the floor of the command chamber. Her back was against the wall. She was doing the thing she did after operations, which was nothing. Not reporting, not debriefing, not constructing the narrative of what had happened. Just being in the moment after, which always felt larger and more honest than the moment during. Decker sat down a few meters away. He still had the oxygen coupling he'd swapped from Voss. He was turning it in his hands. "Sergeant," he said. "Yes, that xenobiologist. The one in Portugal. Yes, are they still there?" Callus thought about this. "I don't know," she said. "We stopped corresponding when the information became operational. Seemed better." She paused. "Why? I want to write to someone like that," Decker said. "After this. Someone who asks about things." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a strange thing to want?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave to questions about corridor layouts and communications architectures. "No," she said. Cherenko finished the ration bar. He looked at the wrapper for a moment, folded it precisely, and tucked it into a pocket. Then he took out a new bar and ate half of it, and wrapped the other half and put it away. And this was the most ceremonially complete thing Callus had seen in months, and she didn't say a word about it. Outside, the fleet was moving. She could hear it in the vibrations through the station's hull. Not here, exactly, but feel in the specific way while that large objects moving through space made their presence known if you were a small object anchored to a station they were approaching. The spine was being surrounded. By the time the official assault teams arrived, the ones with the proper authorization codes and the full complement of equipment, and the commanders who would write the after-action reports, all the difficult work would already be done, and it would fall to Callus to explain, again, that the operation had not proceeded as outlined in the briefing, and she had deviated significantly from authorized parameters, and the communication blackout she had imposed was intentional and not a technical malfunction. She had written some version of this explanation 11 times. She was already composing the 12th. She was also, and she would not have admitted this to anyone who asked, and would have been precise and honest if pressed, she was also thinking about Brennan. Not the Brennan of the memoirs, dictating complaints into a recorder in a hospital ward. The Brennan of the field, before the corridor, before the argument. Standing at the viewport of a dropship 2 years ago, and saying something she had never repeated and would never repeat, because it was too close to true to be said in public. "I think we keep sending people who are good at winning the wars we know how to fight, and I don't know if we know how to fight this one yet," she had thought. We. He had said we, meaning humans, meaning the species, not the fleet or the command structure or the specific officers who wrote the briefings. He had said it without self-pity and without drama, which was the only time she had agreed with him. And the agreement had made her uncomfortable in a way that losing arguments with him never had. She thought about it now because this was the moment when it could be answered. Not with a speech, not with a victory proclamation or a symbolic gesture, or any of the things that official histories would later try to impose on this 19-minute window in a command chamber above a gas giant. With the specific and demonstrable fact that a human sergeant with a notebook full of information nobody else had thought was relevant had walked through 40 seconds of vulnerability, navigated a station configured against every previous human strategy, and convinced a senior Veth commander that surrender was the less costly option. Not through force, not through threat, but through the accumulated weight of 3 years of asking the right questions of the people who had no reason to answer them. We know how to fight it, she thought. We just keep forgetting what fighting looks like. Obina had been quiet this whole time, which was the way he was quiet when something meant something. He spoke now without lifting his head. They're opening the main dock, he said. Fleet's coming in. Callus stood. She brushed off the back of her suit, which served no functional purpose, and which she did anyway, because it was the gesture she had seen her father make whenever he finished something and was about to be asked about it. And it had always seemed to her to mean, I know what I did, and I'm not going to explain it yet. Gear up, she said. They're going to have questions. Voss had started humming again. The folk song. Callus didn't know the name of it and had never asked, but she knew the rhythm by now, and she recognized it the way she recognized everything useful. Not as music exactly, but as information. Voss only hummed it when the danger was past. It was the most reliable indicator she had found. Better than thermal imaging, better than the 16 kilohertz bounce, better than 11 years of pattern analysis. Melo's laugh again from somewhere behind her, the mechanical failure, pure and involuntary. Grice, sitting against the far wall with his upper appendages arranged in the posture that human observers would later argue meant either dignified captivity or deep skepticism, oriented his sensory organs toward the sound. He held this orientation for a long moment. Whatever he made of it, Callus would not know. She had been collecting data on Veth cognition for 3 years, and she still could not read that particular expression. She thought, maybe that's not a gap in the data. Maybe that's just two things in the universe that don't entirely understand each other, sitting in the same room, having survived the encounter. And finding that survival by itself is enough information to start with. The dock doors opened. The corridor filled, and the sound of lights, boots, and the voices of people who had not been in the room when the difficult work happened. Callus walked toward them. Behind her, Decker followed, and Kowalczyk, and the rest of the squad, and the sound of Voss's humming moved with them through the corridor of a station that had not been taken in 11 years, and was now taken, and would take command considerable time to explain in terms that fit the existing doctrine, and would take Callus no time at all, because she had already written the explanation, and it was simple and accurate, and did not use the word insubordination once. It used the word preparation. It used the word knowledge. It used the word attention, which she thought was the correct word, had always been the correct word, for the thing that humans did when they were at their best. The specific, patient, unglamorous practice of watching carefully over a long time and trusting what you saw. Outside the viewport, the gas giant turned, enormous and indifferent. Its ammonia storms, moving in patterns that were ancient, before the first Veth spore had ever drifted between stars. And the fleet moved above it, and the spine held still in the middle of it all, changed from what it had been an hour ago. The way things change when someone pays enough attention to know exactly what they are. Callus filed her report that evening. It was 37 pages. Command's automated processing system flagged it for excessive length, insufficient use of standard tactical terminology, and an anomalous citation structure referencing personal correspondence with a civilian xenobiologist in Portugal. She was officially reprimanded for the anomalous citations. She was unofficially told that the reprimand was required by procedure and would not appear in her service record in any way that affected her career. She was also told that the xenobiologist had been formally contracted as a technical advisor to the Expeditionary Intelligence Division. She wrote to the xenobiologist that evening. She told her what had happened, leaving out the classified elements, which left in most of what had actually happened. She told her about the 16 kilohertz tone. She told her about the ration bar and the folk song and Grice's expression when Mello laughed. At the end she wrote, "Thank you for the diagrams." She didn't explain which diagrams she meant, because the xenobiologist would know. That was the thing about people who paid attention. They always knew which part of the conversation you were still thinking about, even when you hadn't and said so. Outside the viewport of the transport taking her back to the carrier group, the stars were points of cold light in the dark between things, and they looked, as they always did when she was in transit between operations, less like destinations and more like landmarks. Things that told you where you were not because of what they were in themselves, but because of the specific pattern they made together, which was information, which was the only kind of light that had ever mattered. She put the recorder down. She would sleep, and then she would start preparing for the next one. She did not know what it would look like yet, except that she would learn, which was the only plan that had ever worked.